Out of the black of the deep range and into the light of the deep strange. Come at the hour, come at the mothership that is Coast to Coast AM. There it is, floating on the electromagnetic wave. John B. Wells in with you tonight for Coast to Coast AM Saturday night edition, your electromagnetic nightlife impresario. Tonight on the program, first-time guest, Kevin Ryan. He is the co-editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies and a whistleblower from Underwriters Laboratories. You know, the UL tag on the various cords on your various appliances. Yes, that's Underwriters Laboratories. He's contributed to many books and scientific articles on the subject of 9/11. And we're not going to let it go. This is September 2013. 12 years ago. And still so many unanswered questions. Kevin Ryan's made many presentations around the U.S. and Canada, appeared on National Public Radio, Air America Radio, Pacifica Radio, C-SPAN Book TV, Free Speech TV, and Colorado Public Television. His website is Another 19. Don't spell out 19, use the number. Another 19. His book is very compelling. It's a little over 400 pages. I'm seeing 416 pages, investigating legitimate 9/11 suspects. And this is quite a comprehensive work. As a matter of fact, some of the accolades would include one from Lori Van Auken, member of the Family Steering Committee for the 9/11 Commission and widow of Kenneth Van Auken, who was killed at the World Trade Center. Kevin Ryan has written a book that reminds us that the attacks of September 11, 2001 and their details have never really been investigated. Kevin has laid out the historical framework in a way that has never been done before. The importance of this cannot be overstated. Anyway, we'll get into that. There are a lot of names in this book and the people that go with those names shine a light on you. Don't you find that it's just one rumor of a potentially catastrophic conflict after another? It's ridiculous. I'm looking at the various news wires. I have been for hours. And not only does, it's the weekend. Let's postpone apocalypse until Monday. Let's do it then. We'll take the weekend off. But everyone's, are we really going to go head to head with the Russians over the Syria thing? You know, just a quick thought here. Much to the chagrin of those who don't care for them. But when you see the way that our country is handling this Syrian situation, and then you look at the way Vladimir Putin is handling the situation, kind of makes it a little easier to understand how people like Al Capone were made into folk heroes, regardless of the fact that he might just been just a tad on the brutal side. He represents strength. And don't you find that strength is the thing that's admired, even if it's in the hands of a really tough customer? Now, this may grab you. It grabbed me. Boy, did it. Human mind control experiment, a success. Posted yesterday. This is actually from the Coast to Coast AM website. Unexplained mysteries. Previous mind control research has enabled brain-to-brain communication between rats. But it is believed this is the first time such a system has been successful with human subjects. The remarkable experiment was conducted by Rajesh Rao and Andrea Stocco, who captured the whole bloody thing on video. Rao was equipped with a special cap fitted with electrodes that were hooked up to a machine capable of reading electrical activity in the brain, while Stocco sat on the other side of the campus with a transcranial magnetic stimulation coil placed over the region of his brain responsible for hand movements. Now get this. For the experiment, Rao would look at a screen and play a simple computer game that involved firing a cannon, but instead of actually pressing a button, he instead imagined his right hand moving to do so. Across the campus, Stocco, who was unable to see or hear the game, felt his hand moving in correlation to Rao's thoughts a sensation that he likened to a nervous tic. Quote, "It was both exciting and eerie to watch an imagined action from my brain get translated into actual action by another brain. This was basically a one-way flow of information from my brain to his. The next step is having a more equitable two-way conversation directly between the two brains." It's stuff like that that drives me and should drive you to coasttocoastam.com. Every day there's something kind of interesting. It's liable to grab you. Glowing reports from the Aurora Zone. Ghost of bank robber seen at intersection. Controlling weather with lasers. Hay devil. A hay devil. Hay. Caught on camera in Hampshire. From BBC. Now back to Syria. Pat Buchanan, he's a, three-time presidential advisor. He has joined the growing number of mainstream voices now specifically labeling the recent chemical attacks in Syria as a false flag. Wonder where those chemical weapons came from. Are those George Bush's chemical weapons he was convinced that he had, and everybody thought, well, of course you didn't find any. They moved them all to Syria. Interesting video all over the place, strange little blue thing with a stick on it that goes down the cannon barrel, and boom, off it goes. It's interesting that nobody's wearing any protective gear in these videos. It's funny, Cameron got shot down by Parliament for the first time since 1782. As the world goes, we think maybe this awakening really has occurred, and maybe we don't feel like having another war. But they're going to push it and push it. So if you don't want it, you know what to do. Just push back. Just push back. And you're doing it, and kudos to you, because that's what's happening. Pushing back. And as the leaders push one way, we must have a war, we must do this. Our pushing back just makes them look sillier and sillier and sillier. Air National Guard accidentally dropped a practice bomb onto a bar parking lot. Well, it didn't hit anybody, but that's good. That's good. It's very good. And from Vandenberg Air Force Base, the largest rocket ever launched has been launched. At least the largest one ever launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base. It had a successful liftoff just this past Wednesday. It's the Delta IV Heavy rocket. It was launched with a $1 billion spy satellite. Oh, what else? And here's another three-letter agency for you. The NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office. And it's all done in support of national defense. Well, of course. That's according to aerospace engineering firm United Launch Alliance, or ULA. Once in orbit, the classified payload is expected to be able to distinguish details back on Earth as minute as the make and model of an automobile, according to a ULA spokesperson. They alerted the public that through Facebook and Twitter, so that the public would not be concerned when they felt their windows rattle and felt the vibrations of a gigantic rocket lifting off from Vandenberg. Official launch time was supposed to be 10:52. Actually went off. It was a little late. Went off at 11:03. And the Los Angeles Times aerospace reporter, Mr. Bill Hennigan, told, what is it? A station that does not broadcast Coast to Coast AM in L.A., residents up and down the California coastline may have heard or even felt the 235-foot rocket following the launch. So how about that? Okay. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg will, she did, officiate a same-sex wedding Saturday in what is believed to be a first for a member of the nation's highest court. Yes, Justice Ginsburg officiated Saturday at the marriage of Kennedy Center President Michael Kaiser and John Roberts, a government economist. Michael Kaiser is a friend and someone I much admire, Ginsburg said in a written statement Friday. That's why I'm officiating at the wedding. She's 80, an opera lover, frequent guest at the center. Anyway, just thought you'd like to know. Don't know why, but I thought I would. Tebow got canned from the Patriots. What else? Man accused of threatening to behead Congresswoman arrested in Mexico. That's not really a very good idea to threaten to behead a congressperson. And the summer of 2013 among the coolest on record in Alabama. Some are saying that the massive Yosemite blaze may have been sparked by, yes, Yes, illegal marijuana growers. The massive forest fire that scorched 333 square miles in and around Yosemite National Park may have been sparked by illegal marijuana growers, according to one fire official in the county. San Jose Mercury News reported that Todd McNeil, chief of the Twainhart Fire Department, told a community meeting it was highly suspect that there might have been some sort of illicit grove, a marijuana grow type thing, he said. Anyway, he has 23 years of experience with the Forest Service, so maybe he's got something there. Maybe Spark One Up was taken to a bit of an extreme. Anyway, if you know the numbers, I wish you'd call them. We'll chat for, the better part of an hour and get ready for Kevin Robert Ryan. His book is Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects. I wonder what he means by that. I bet I know. Do you know? Oh, by the way, before we go to our break, the NSA hacked Al Jazeera too, so they like to spread it around. This is Coast to Coast AM. We'll be right back with your calls. Please stand by. It's ridiculous. Every creature on Earth seems to have a problem or a potential problem. Egyptian authorities detained a suspected spy bird. Yes, a man in Egypt's Kena Governorate, some 280 miles southeast of Cairo, found a suspicious bird among 4 others near his home and brought them to a police station on Friday. Officers and the man puzzled over the electronic device attached to the suspected winged infiltrator. On Saturday, a veterinary committee called by concerned government officials determined the device was neither a bomb nor a spying device. We will waterboard this one. No, sorry, that's what we do. Forget it. Instead, they discovered it was just a wildlife tracker used by some French scientists to follow the movement of migrating birds. So the swan was released. No one is safe. No one. Wildcard line number 1. Zach, San Pedro, California. How you doing?
Great. Great to be on with you, John.
Good to have you.
Yeah.
How's your week? What's on your mind? What's happening?
Well, one word. I know you got a great guest coming on, and the word is false flag. Well, actually, it's more than one word. False flag attack.
Yeah.
And I know that we're gearing up pretty heavily for this Syrian strike. But I just like to send one out to all the listeners. Just be really careful and maybe call your states, your senators, whoever you could call, and let them know how you feel, because I don't know about you, but I'm tired of the false flag attacks, and I'm tired of always looking for a reason to find war and weapons of mass destruction that aren't there.
Yeah, it makes you wonder who the terrorists are, since we're continuously, as members of the general population, being terrorized by the thoughts of some form of annihilation, whether it's solar flare is going to get us. No, wait, it's an asteroid. No, I know, it's another war. I mean, I'm just kind of burned out on the whole concept of, if I were a kid now, I don't think I'd care much about playing Army, let's put it that way. Nothing against the Army, I'm just saying playing war, let's put it that way. You know what I mean?
Well, I come from a long line of American military, and I'm for national defense, and we need to have a presence, and that's all fine and dandy. But, yeah, can we please tone back the rhetoric and the false flags, and let's worry about our people here at home. That's I'll take your answer on air for that, John. Great for having me. Thanks.
Okay, Zach. Yeah, it's some of the worst catastrophes in history have been caused by harsh words. So it's probably a good idea, unless you're prepared to back up your words, not to use them at all. So now, unfortunately, our government has put itself in the position of either looking weak, stupid, or both. So there's a trifecta of buffoonery if I ever heard it. It's like, whatever happened to diplomacy? Now we're finally going to go to Congress and ask them. Well, I don't really need to go to Congress, but I will anyway. So the House and the Senate are going to hold some hearings next week, but the door is still left open in case Congress votes no. It's just, I don't know. There are some elements of our human population here that just never seem to get enough. I suppose war is still just as good a business as it ever was. Wildcard line number 2, Peter on the East Coast. What's going on?
John, it's good to talk to you again. It's Peter Kahn, and I've got 3 pieces of news about what's going on in Syria, which I just posted in the past few days online on my blog
Excellent.
and Facebook, which I want to give your listeners a big heads up on.
Okay.
Right. The first one is, I'm sure you heard about the protests that went on several hours ago in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Boston, and other major cities calling for the U.S. government not to stop its war against Syria.
Have not heard of any such reports, except just little hints that there might have been some. What do you have on that? Or were they very large?
Well, here's the thing. Not only were they not very large, they were put on by a group called International Answer. Now, I had some bad dealings with International Answer about a decade ago with the anti-war protests. Essentially, in other words, like 10 years ago, they were saying, no, stop the war in Iraq, stop the war in Afghanistan. But they would not let any Iraqis or Afghanis speak at their protests. And the leadership of International Answer, not only do they receive government funding, but the leadership of International Answer comprises the same people who are the leadership of ACORN and the leadership of the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Now, what do you make of this?
Well, for one, they're definitely provocateurs. I mean, I can remember 10 years ago when I was dealing with these people, me and some other people would come from and say, wait a minute, you're protesting the government, and yet the government is paying you to protest. I mean, I remember what they said in Germany 100 years ago about protests. They would say, back then in Germany, they would say people only protest when they are ordered to protest. We know what Germany was like 100 years ago.
Yeah, we know what it was like 60 or 70 years ago, too.
It was the same way. Now, little tidbit number 2. Now, this you'd have to go to my public Facebook page to see, but 1 year ago, you know how there are 5 American destroyers off the coast of Syria waiting for orders to attack?
That's what they say,
One of those destroyers is the USS Gravely, DDG 107. Now, I had a chance to visit that ship 1 year ago during one of the fleet weeks. Now, when I was aboard, some of the crew members made some racist comments about Iran. And they got a little surprised when I was able to correct them about facts on Iran's military, and as well as the militaries of the region.
Interesting. Very interesting. Please continue. You have another tidbit for us?
Another tidbit for us? Well, one, but you'd have to go. You can see this also on my blog and more of this on my public Facebook page. But I posted some links from my old. For 5 years. I was at the Middle East Studies Department at Brown University, which is part of their Watson Institute for International Studies. A few weeks ago, one of the professors at large from the Watson Institute, Mr. Paulo Sergio Pinheiro, he gave a big speech at the UN advocating a strike against Syria. Now, just do a Google search on the Watson Institute for International Studies. You'll see this is an institute packed with Council on Foreign Relations members. They deal a lot with trilateralists, global elitists at every level. I'm talking about all your worth. Like, in other words, everything Alex Jones talks about. People want to dismiss it as conspiracy. Wait till if they ever dealt with some of these people in person and see what they're really like, they'll realize some of the stuff that you talk about on shows like this, it's not fiction, it's not conspiracy, it's real and it's happening.
Mm-hmm.
These are evil people.
All right. Well, go ahead and give us your blog real quick in case somebody wants to take a look at it. Why not?
Well, just do a search. Peter Kahn, as in Genghis Khan.
K-A-H-N.
K-H-A-N, yep.
Sorry, man. I'm sorry. I had dyslexia of the Khan for a minute. K-H-A-N.
All
right, very good.
Just like one little quick tidbit on the public Facebook page for the Watson Institute. The Watson Institute is named after Thomas J. Watson Jr. He was one of the founders of IBM, and he was also a global elitist and a eugenicist. Now, he's dead, but his daughter, Lucinda Watson, posts quite a bit on Facebook. And you can actually check out her profile there on Facebook. This woman is whacked in the head.
And this is the Watson Institute. What's the rest of it?
Watson Institute for International Studies. It's named
for International Studies. All right, Peter, we got to run. I hear the music, so that means we got to take a break. But thanks for checking in, and we'll take a look at the Watson Institute for International Studies and see what we can see. Yeah, that's what we're going to see. We're going to see what we can see Yeah. Okay. Got a few more calls lined up as we make our way up to the top of the next hour, and we'll talk with Kevin Robert Ryan. His book, Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects. And his website is Another 19. That's another19.com. Check it out. All right. We got enough time to go and get the kettle up and running? Yeah, you do. Absolutely. Make sure it's a porcelain cup. Make yourself a proper cup of tea and come right back. This is Coast to Coast AM. Now, is this even possible? Seriously. This is from InfoWars. Paul Joseph Watson put this out yesterday. Militants tell AP reporter they mishandled Saudi-supplied chemical weapons causing accident. Syrian rebels in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta, or Ghouta, Ghouta, have admitted to Associated Press correspondent Dale Gavlak that they were responsible for last week's chemical weapons incident, which Western powers have blamed on Bashar al-Assad's forces, revealing that the casualties were the result of an accident caused by rebels mishandling chemical weapons provided to them by Saudi Arabia. Are you getting this? Seriously. Quote, from numerous interviews with doctors, Ghouta residents, rebel fighters, and their families, many believe that certain rebels received chemical weapons via the Saudi intelligence chief, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, and were responsible for carrying out the, in parenthesis, deadly gas attack, writes Gavlik. And right here on the page, there's a backup version there, in case this one's deleted. Rebels told Gavlak that they were not properly trained on how to handle the chemical weapons, or even told what they were. It appears as though the weapons were initially supposed to be given to the Al-Qaeda offshoot Jabhat al-Nusra. They were very curious about these arms, and unfortunately some of the fighters handled the weapons improperly and set off the explosions. Oh my gosh, one militant named Jay told Gavlak. His claims are echoed by another female fighter named Kay. That's just the letter K, who told Gavlak, they didn't tell us what these arms were or how to use them. We didn't know they were chemical weapons. We never imagined they were chemical weapons. Abu Abdel Monaim, the father of an opposition rebel, also told Gavlak, my son came to me 2 weeks ago asking what I thought these weapons were that he had been asked to carry, describing them as having a tube-like structure, while others were like a huge gas bottle. The father names the Saudi militant who provided the weapons as Abu Ayesha. And according to Abdel Monem, the weapons exploded inside a tunnel, killing 12 rebels. So, there you go. I mean, is this something or is this something? And there's so much information coming in from all over the place saying we really don't need to get into a brawl over here in Syria, send our troops back into harm's way. What are you going to do, launch a few cruise missiles? Get those, what are they, Tomahawks? Send those babies in there, and just warships. I think a fifth warship has been sent there. Maybe it's already there by now. And Putin's just got his face in his hands going, this is stupid. I think it's kind of stupid, too. I don't know how you feel about it, of course, because it's the one-way transmission, unless you contact me by email at johnb@coasttocoastam.com, JOHN, B as in Bravo, at coasttocoastam.com. Alternately, you can use info@caravantomidnight.com, in case this email box locks up again. But how do you feel about another war? Had enough yet? All right, when we come back, we'll talk with Vince. He's on wildcard line number 3 in New Orleans, but we're going to take this break real quick so we can talk to him for a few minutes. Here we go. This is Coast to Coast AM. Hit me with that thunderclap. Alan sent an email, and it says, this bleep that Bush and the feds were responsible for the 9/11 attacks is pure bull based on misconceptions and paranoia. If you persist in this conspiracy insanity, I will just change channels. That's okay, Alan. That's okay. I have some empathy for you, brother. Better that you did that than I jettison you from the mothership. Because if you get jettisoned from the mothership, let me tell you what happens. You float around out there in nothingness. You eventually get a hole in your suit, and then you just pop. And I guess it won't matter much what happens after that, will it? Let's talk to Vince in New Orleans. How you doing? Vince, Vinny. Hey, how you doing?
John B. Oh, what a pleasure it is to talk to you. I always, if you're on, I'll stay up and make some coffee.
Oh, man, that's great. I thank you for that, and thanks for the call. What's on your mind?
I'm calling from the greater New Orleans area, WRNO 99.5, and I'm an old baby boomer, hip from the 60s and 70s, and a little background. I've been tear gassed and arrested in Miami Beach with Jane Fonda for inciting a riot and stopping the Vietnam War.
Yep.
And since I'm in my 60s now, I'm a born-again Christian, and I spend the last 10, 12 years doing a lot of studying, and I would like to enlighten, if I could, some of our listeners about what's actually going on in Syria. In my view, as a Christian, is that when two devils are in battle, who do you side with? I think that personally, and I'm sorry if I offend anybody, I think Mohammed's in hell. And as a Christian, I have to say that it's incorrect, but that's the way I feel. And as far as a lot of things I've learned, I got involved. I started waking up to a lot of things from the old John Birch Society, and now I even believe McCarthy, because I see the sewer pipe coming out of L.A. and Hollywood. It's gross. Miley Cyrus and all. This is terrible. It's just not the right way to go. Going to I'd like to mention a man named Manuelus, who actually wrote the Communist Manifesto, Demetrius Manuelski, and the 10 planks of the Communist Manifesto is like turning on the news or reading the newspaper. It is unbelievable. It will make anybody's hair stand on end.
You know, you said you got tear gassed out there with Jane Fonda. You know, a lot of people are still mad at her.
Well, let me tell you what, Jane, I saw an interview with her about an hour long on some show, and she has left her atheist husband, billionaire, globalist husband, and found faith.
Mm-hmm.
And I was about 15, 20 feet from her in Miami Beach. I lived in Miami for 20 years, and I got tear gassed, and I got my knee broken with a baton and got arrested for inciting a riot.
Oh, man.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I love your bumper music. Oh, and the guy that just called that says the 9/11's bunk,
yeah,
just asking to research building number 7, how the hell it fell down and blew up and imploded and fell down at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, wasn't hit by a plane.
Oh, wait till you hear Kevin Ryan talk about that. He worked for UL. And just to give you a little tease, UL couldn't figure out why that the buildings fell like they did. We're not talking about 7 now, but the other ones fell because they were certified for fire, and they're going, what? And
it was only jet fuel, and jet fuel, it's not like you think it is. It's not even, it won't even hardly burn. It's not as good as kerosene.
Yeah, you know what the difference between regular old farm diesel and jet fuel is?
Yeah.
Almost nothing.
It won't melt. Aluminum.
Yep. All right, I got to run, Vince. Got to get a couple more calls in here, but thank you very much. And, I can't get down there, so I hope you'll have a soft shell crab poor boy sandwich for me, because I'll tell you, I could sure use one. You know what what Vince was talking about, how the media. I'll tell you, I'm looking forward to talking to this lady at some point in the very near future. Her name is Amber Lyon. She's an ex-CNN reporter. And I'll just read a little something here to you. She revealed, this is out of Prague, ex-CNN reporter Amber Lyon revealed that during her work for the channel, she received orders to send false news and exclude some others, which the U.S. administration did not favor, with the aim to create a public opinion in favor of launching and aggression on Iran and Syria. Lyon was quoted by the Slovak main news website as saying that the mainstream U.S. media outlets intentionally worked to create a propaganda against Iran to garner public opinion support for a military invasion against it. She revealed that the scenarios used before launching the war on Iraq is being prepared to be repeated, where Iran and Syria are now being subject to constant demonization. Now, please keep in mind, I support our men and women in uniform. I do. But as we've gone through these Saturday nights together and a few other nights as well, and you've heard these stories about how we're losing fighter pilots, and the Air Force is willing to pay a six-figure bonus spread out over 9 years if they'll just re-up. And I do support the troops, and I think that the best way to support the troops is to bring them home. I'm tired of seeing these young men and women torn up in these endless, undeclared conflicts. I appreciate the Wounded Warrior Project. I think if anybody can donate some money or can build one of those burn centers like Denzel Washington contributed to, notice how he stays down under the radar and does some good work, while the ones who aren't nearly as good an artist as he is are out there going all over the place. Denzel is actually doing something. I urge people to take care of our wounded, because it's not going to be the government that takes care of them, you know? Well, what are we supposed to think? Oh, here's a random thought for you that some people out there may not appreciate. How exactly am I supposed to feel? How are you exactly supposed to feel when we see one young man after another missing an arm, missing both arms, missing a leg, missing both legs, learning to run on prosthetic legs, learning to live again as he was before he volunteered to protect his country, her country. I say his, that means everybody, you know, like mankind, you know, it's everybody, anybody who participates. I don't want to have to contribute to those organizations. I don't want there to be a reason for it. But look at this. Seriously, this is not the anti-war station, but seriously, folks, how much of this are we supposed to put up with? How many false flags have there been from the battleship Maine to the Gulf of Tonkin to Pearl Harbor to 9/11 that we're going to talk about tonight with Kevin Robert Ryan? I can't help it. I've got a public forum, so I'll just tell you. I'm not squeamish about getting it on against an enemy. Sometimes, as Wayne Gross said, you have to get it on. You have to. But if you don't have to, you don't. Let's take another one real quick. Gloria, east of the Rockies, east of the Wookiees in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, home of the Harley. She's gone. She gave up. Gloria, Gloria, do not give up. How about west of the Rockies, the Wookiees, in Wasilla, Alaska? That would be James.
Mr. Weld?
Yes, sir.
My name is James, and first of all, I'd like to invite you up here to come see how wonderful it is, and I will buy you reindeer sausages.
Excellent.
The
I don't know what they are, but I'll take one.
I'm concerned about is Syria.
Yep.
I get various emails. I go through various news sources, and one of them is the Christian-Jewish Alliance. It's news from Israel. You got to remember, Syria is Russia's Israel. I mean, it's put there kind of like as a balance of power thing.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
I can see that.
Israel is preparing for the arrival of Russian warships. And the second thing I have to say is, if we get American warships and Russian warships, that's not rattling sabers. The sabers are drawn. And the other thing I wanted to say is, I forgot.
That's all right. We got a second. Get a hold of it. It is interesting that Syria has a Russian Navy base there, and Putin said, months ago now, no. If you put the armed forces in there, there's going to be a problem. So I don't know. It almost seems as though there are forces at work that are trying to provoke us into a third world war, so somebody can really make some money, because somebody always makes some. Did you get a hold of your thought again, or did you lose it?
I completely lost. I got to listening to you. Oh yeah, I remember what it was. Do you ever think about doing audio books? You have the perfect voice for it.
You know, that's not a bad idea, but no one has asked me to do that. Outside of Steve Quayle, and I said, man, I can't do this. This is going to take 5,000 hours to read this stuff. But so that didn't actually happen. But thank you for that compliment. It's either that or, I don't know, phone chat or something. If they toss me off coast, maybe I'll be on the end of a 900 number or something.
You only have two rivals, and that's George and Art. And I heard Art is coming back. But other than that, you're the best I've heard.
Well, I appreciate you, man. Thanks a lot.
Take
care. I'll get up there for some of that sausage you were talking about. Like I said, I don't know what it is, but I'll try almost anything once. I'll check it out. If somebody said, "Here, have some of these mountain oysters," some years ago, I would have gone, "Sure, it sounds good," as long as you don't tell me what they are. First time caller, Chuck in Kentucky. Are you there, Chuck?
I want to thank you for what you do. God bless all you and your staff for trying to wake up America, because what you're talking about tonight I've been trying to get something done for these vets, that they send them to war and they bring them back and they won't take care of them. They won't take care of them. They don't care about their. They send them to war and they come back and I found out they cut their pay off when they can't do their job. Then they make them wait 9 to 18 months for any disability. By that time, he's done lost his home, everything he owns, and then he fights for this country, but our country don't back them up. And there's a guy down here in Kentucky, Jimmy Higdon, that's trying to work on this about change the law where if these guys come back from war and they can't get them on disability and take care of them, they need to keep on paying them like they do everybody else in Congress. And I'm tired of the way they treat them. And our country, that ought to be our number one priority. We got money for everything else. Egypt, Congress, all they're worried about is elections. They ain't worried about this country, and they're not worried about our veterans that fight for our country. When they come back, they just don't care about them.
I know what you mean. Thanks very much for that call. Yeah. I think I probably better reserve a comment that I have percolating in the back. It might be just a little bit too strong for some. I'll just say this. My countrymen and countrywomen are precious to me. They don't have to agree with everything I say. They're Americans. And if they go and carry a rifle, they go into harm's way and they get hurt, I expect for our country to take care of them when they come back. And that's all there is to it. And take care of them to whatever degree is necessary. If we can put zillions upon zillions of people on the welfare rolls and keep them there, in many cases people who could work, but because there's money in poverty, many of them are being paid more to not work than they would be paid to actually have gainful employment. If we can do that, we can take care of our people when they get hurt. We can provide some job placement for them. By the way, has anybody heard anything about a jobs program lately? No? No, neither have I. All right, get ready. Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects, a great book by Kevin Robert Ryan. It's coming up quick. This is Coast to Coast AM. Thanks for being with us tonight. Well, this is an amazing book, and we must not get tired. We must not get tired of, look, we're just here for a little while. Life is short. Everybody knows that. Some lives are shorter than others. Some go on and on. Seems like, look at Fidel Castro. He just keeps hanging in there no matter what. They say only the good die young. I think there must have been a very, very good reason for that little cliche having been created. That's what a cliche is. It's something that's commonly used that at one time made a great deal of sense and still does. But in any case, what happened on 9/11 was absolutely unbelievable, and it is undeniable that the world has changed, and not for the better since then. Privacy out the window. Now, you and I both know in our quiet moments that the security services have been listening to our telephone conversations for a long time. However, there are some people of integrity from back in the day when the surveillance apparatus was really capable of listening to a lot of people and doing it well. There was a responsibility that these men and women felt was incumbent upon them to protect the integrity of their operation by ensuring the privacy of the individual American citizen. And don't you find that over the succeeding decades, there has been a de-emphasizing of the right of the individual to be individual, as number 2 praised. Number 6, that would have been played by Patrick McGowan in that fabulous series, The Prisoner from 1968, 9 maybe, 68 I believe, yeah. Yeah, we want to become part of the collective. Lean on the government. The government will help you. We don't. I mean, when's the last time you saw a kid take a lawnmower engine apart or build an engine in a garage or learn how to fix something? Now just call somebody. You know, oh, yeah, we've all gone so green that we have disposable everything. We don't set the milk bottles out there to be picked up, washed, and then reused. We don't cash in our soda bottles anymore and get a little change for them and then have those washed and reused. No, we just throw more and more plastic into the landfill, and then when we feel like, well, we're running a little bit low on money, what can we do about that? I know, a carbon tax. Well, a global warming thing's gone right out the window, don't you think? Over 2,000 record low temperatures this year. Only 600 record high temperatures this year. And Mr. Gore is much, much richer than he ever was before, and still somehow people think that he is an authority on global warming. And a lot of people are prepared to swallow that sort of junk science, and these are the same people who don't even know who their elected representatives are. So, back to 911 in this book, Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects by Kevin Robert Ryan. We cannot let this go. We cannot get tired. We cannot quit pushing back against government. We cannot quit pushing back against a dishonest mainstream media. We cannot get tired of pushing back against propaganda. And in just about 2 minutes, we're going to let Kevin Robert Ryan loose and tell us whatever it is he wants to tell a few million of his closest friends right here on Coast to Coast AM. Stand by. All right, his book is Another 19. His website is another19.com. Use the numbers, ANOTHER19.com. Kevin Ryan, welcome to the program. First-time guest. Glad to have you.
Thank you, John. I'm glad to be with you tonight.
This is a brand new book. Copyright's 2013, so how long has it been out?
It's only been out about 2 months.
Love it. Well, I received your copy and just started reading it, and I just thought, I had to stop every once in a while and just not put my face in both hands, but just put a palm against my forehead and just lean on that elbow for a minute and go, good grief, how deep does this really go? Tell us about you and your what led you to be with Underwriters Laboratories and what happened then, and just take it away.
Well, I'm a chemistry laboratory manager by trade, and that's how I ended up working for Underwriters Laboratories. And I led a division of UL for a number of years. And when I worked there, I was in communication with the chief executive officer and also other top managers at UL, and learned that the company had, back in the 1960s, had done the fire resistance testing for the steel components used in the World Trade Center towers. And that's basically the kind of work that UL does, including the division that I worked for. We did safety testing of all sorts of things.
And is that destructive testing in many cases?
That's right, it is. And in case of the steel components, the idea is to prepare them in exactly the form that they'd be used in a building, and to use a standard test to test the fire resistance, the ability to hold its load, and the transference of temperature. And this is all done in huge furnaces in various locations that UL owns. So what they did for the World Trade Center was they ensured that the steel columns and the floor assemblies used in the towers would be able to withstand very intense fires for hours. In fact, the steel used in the World Trade Center towers was certified to withstand 3 hours in terms of the floor assemblies and 4 hours of intense fire in terms of the columns. And one of the glaring problems with that is one of the World Trade Center towers was completely destroyed in only 56 minutes.
At what temperature, Kevin?
Well, in the temperatures in a typical office fire are about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. And in the furnaces, they're 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And as I said, they're exposed to these temperatures for hours and not just a few minutes.
Right.
So the World Trade Center was designed to withstand the impact of airliners. That was stated very clearly by the man who was the chief design engineer, John Skilling. And in addition, the steel components were certified to ensure that they would withstand hours of intense fire. That's not what happened on 9/11.
Nope.
No, and so in 2003, I began asking questions about this, primarily because, frankly, I was politically ignorant in many ways, looking back in hindsight now. But, it occurred to me it was clear to me that the lies that were used to start the Iraq War were told in a concerted effort. There was actually an organized effort, including people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, to lie the American public into this enormous war. And that led me to ask when the lying might have begun. And it reminded me of these communications I'd had with UL executives. And so I started asking questions. And for about a year, I asked questions at UL about how this could have happened. And I found that no one at the company could explain how those buildings could have been destroyed in the way that the official reports said that they were. I was told to wait for this report from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, and I did that. And when I saw the report, I found that the report ignored the physical tests that were done as part of the investigation, which my company helped to perform. They built floor models of the World Trade Center floors, put them in the furnaces again, just to repeat the whole test over again, and found that the floors would not fail. And they did steel temperature tests and found that the steel temperatures that were seen at the World Trade Center were less than 500 degrees Fahrenheit. So this didn't add up, and I ended up writing to the government, and as a result of that, I was fired at UL. That was 9 years ago.
Did they consider this request whistleblowing?
Well, I'm not sure if they use that term, but technically that is one of the definitions of whistleblowing, in that you're exposing information that is otherwise not available to the public with regard to a company's activities or the government's activities. And so that's what I have been called over the years, and I'm open to that. I welcome that sort of thing, because I believe, I'm an American citizen, and I believe that we as American citizens have an obligation to take control of our destiny, not allow these events of 9/11, which were the origin of the war on terror, to devastate our country financially, morally, in so many ways. I think that we really need to find out the truth about what happened, and not just an academic truth, but actual truth that leads to justice. And that's my mission, has been for 10 years now.
Kevin, this is really quite a pregnant point that you have made, and that is that even asking an indiscreet question could constitute whistleblowing and the vilification that follows it.
Yeah, and, so my questions were very pointed, very specific about the tests that were performed by NIST and UL, and how the report conclusions ignored those tests. And as a laboratory manager doing similar types of testing, meaning testing to national standards, that would never have been even considered in the laboratories that I managed, where you would run a test and you would totally ignore the results in order to come up with what ultimately was a political conclusion supporting the preconceived notions of what happened on 9/11.
Now, the NIST is, as you pointed out, is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and it was formerly known as the National Bureau of Standards.
Yeah.
How can you get away with ignoring the the testing of the structure, and it doesn't come into public awareness at all? They just go right on by it.
Well, over the years, we've found that people from NIST have expressed the fact that they were under a lot of pressure to essentially support the political story, and I believe that's common now that I've learned more in government scientist work. Basically, they're paid to overlook things that don't support the political framework that they are paid by. And so it's not terribly surprising to me now, but at the time I was really just outraged. I couldn't believe that, especially given the import, what 9/11 really meant to all of us. I couldn't believe that scientists would just falsify their work. And now, to some extent, I have to say that I'm sure they're honest people at NIST, although perhaps not brave enough to speak out and lose their job. But the conclusions, I believe, were framed by different people than the people who did the actual testing. So it may be a complicated situation in that regard.
Well, we have a couple hours and a half. We do have a number of commercials that we play, and we got about 40 minutes per hour for actual conversation. So if I seem to be pushing us along here, you just kind of control it from your end, and we'll both fly this airplane tonight, okay?
Okay.
Some of the points that you make here, the many opportunities for U.S. intelligence agencies to track down and capture the alleged hijackers should have resulted in the attacks being stopped before they happened. Another point you make, 4 planes should not have been hijacked because the systems in place to prevent hijackings should have been effective. Then the U.S. chain of command should have responded to the attacks immediately, but it did not. And then the U.S. National Air Defenses should have responded effectively, and some, if not all, of the hijacked aircraft should have been intercepted by military jets, but were not. And the 3 WTC buildings should not have fallen through what should have been the path of most resistance. And then, of course, there's Building 7 and that famous BBC report where the correspondent is talking about the building having collapsed and it's standing in the background. Then they go off the air and then they come back. Oh, we've reconnected with our correspondent. Go ahead. And the building's down at that point. My problem with all of this, Kevin, is where is the outrage? I mean, you're talking about you're an American citizen. I'm an American citizen. I want the answers. You feel like we should have the answers so that we can, forge our way through the future with a foundation of truth and some integrity, and yet it's just not happening.
Yeah, well, there actually are millions of Americans who have been crying out for the truth about 9/11, and for many years. In 2006, there was a poll by Scripps Howard that showed that 36% of the American public believed that in some way the Bush administration must have been either involved or allowed the 9/11 attacks to occur so that the country could go to war in the Middle East. And so there have definitely been many people calling for the truth about 9/11. There is, unfortunately, I found a need to improve on the media sources that we look to. For example, Coast to Coast provides information that you're not going to find on CNN, and others. And we need to support those kinds of media if we're ever really going to allow these kinds of questions to progress until we find truth and justice and hopefully ultimately some peace in our lives.
Well, all right then. But as we see, how long have we been in the Middle East now? This is the 10th year. We went in there in March of 2003, right? Yeah.
Yeah, October 2001 actually is when we invaded Afghanistan, but you're right, March 2003 is when we invaded Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now you're talking here about another 19. Now is that literally 19 other people, or is that title a metaphorical title?
Yeah, it's somewhat of a metaphorical title. The idea is to state, okay, the government has finally told us what they believe occurred, and they say that there were 19 young Arab Muslim men led by Osama bin Laden, and if you look closer, another fellow by the name of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. So these 21 people really pulled off this completely unbelievable attack, overcoming the trillion-dollar defense system, intelligence system of the United States. The point of the book is to say, okay, we know what you said. Those of us who have read the 9/11 Commission report and the NIST report have found them very lacking in terms of providing the actual answers. So, some of these things could really not have been accomplished by young Arab Muslim men. And we could talk for a long time about that. But we can, as independent citizens, suggest ways in which these questions that haven't been answered, which you nicely outlined, how did 3 tall buildings fall through what should have been the path of most resistance? How could the national air defenses have been disabled for 2 hours, and so forth and so on? We can propose 19 other people, in this book I do, who were actually in position to make those things happen exactly as they did. And, for my part, I spent 6 years investigating the scientific side of this, the World Trade Center specifically. And in the last 4 years, I decided to say, I said to myself, well, we've been calling for a new investigation for so long. Why don't we start doing some of this investigation? And that was the point with another 19. Let's look at another 19 people, partly because people seem to believe that it's, the official account is more believable because it's only 19 people. Well, here's only 19 people who actually had the power to do what was done and still not been explained.
Understood. All right, then. Yeah, this is an interesting little quote right at the top of Chapter 2 of Kevin Ryan's book, Another 19. Quote, he's a ruthless little bastard. You can be sure of that. And that's former President Richard Nixon describing Donald Rumsfeld. What a perfect cover. We'll talk about that with Kevin Ryan when we come back. What a perfect cover. You're going to war for the oil, but we didn't take the oil. Well, you're going to war so Halliburton can rebuild the whole country. That didn't happen either. So if that didn't happen, doesn't that lend some credibility to the so-called official story that this really was a fight against terror? We'll be right back. This is Coast to Coast AM. Yes, indeed. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories concerning the attacks of September the 11th. I've said this before, and I'll say it again to make sure that everybody who may possibly tune in to the Saturday night edition of Coast to Coast AM or any other broadcast where your humble narrator and talk show guy, John B. Wells, that's me, might be presiding over. I liked George Bush in the beginning. I thought he was an okay guy. And at first blush, when these attacks on the World Trade Center occurred, I thought, yeah, it's kind of good to have a Wyatt Earp character in there going, yeah, we're going to go kick some rump over this. And it started looking worse and worse and worse. So As much as I may have liked you at one time, Mr. Bush, I got to tell you, we're going to continue to entertain these, what might be called outrageous conspiracy theories, until somebody comes up with an answer that doesn't make Mickey Mouse look like a genius. Okay? Are we clear? Okay, good. Another 19, that's the book. Another 19, that's the website. Use the number 19, another19.com. The work by Kevin Robert Ryan. We'll be right back. This is Coast to Coast AM. Kevin Ryan, tell me, if you will, and a few million of our closest friends, just a couple of guys talking here with a big room, what was the stated reason for Underwriters Laboratories to cut you loose?
Well, they said that I had harmed their relationship with the client NIST. So NIST was a client of UL. And in my termination letter, which I still have, of course, is just the statement that I had harmed the company's relationship with its client NIST.
Yeah. I'm curious about something. Sometimes I'll ask a question, and if you don't want to go into it, just say, nah, I don't want to go there, and I'll let it go, seriously. But what sort of a reception did you get when you, naturally, because a couple of these radio outlets were certainly left-leaning, and they're not going to support the Republican president no matter what. They'll take a shot at him. That's just how it is. You know, we get that. Right does it to the left does it to the right. And like I say, one prostitute works one side of the street, one works the other side of the street, and the street goes that way, and we're all going that way. Yeah. What sort of response did you get when you went on NPR and Air America and outlets like that?
Well, different responses. So on NPR, I was brought into a show called On Point, and they brought in a substitute host, and they also brought in two people who are known in the subject as debunkers. So they brought in James Miggs of Popular Mechanics, a Hearst publication. They brought in a Canadian man named Jonathan Kay, and the subject was about 9/11 skepticism. So they invited me as the sole 9/11 skeptic.
Right.
And basically every 30 seconds they use some form of the term conspiracy theorist. They gave me about 5 minutes to respond to that in the hour-long show, so that wasn't very good. But on Air America, I debated a man named Michael Shermer, who is the editor of a magazine called Skeptic, and it turns out Shermer is not very skeptical about most things that are risk to authoritarian power. But that went fairly well, and we were both given fair and equal amounts of time, and so that went pretty well. I've also been on Pacifica Radio, where generally it's the same sort of thing, a debate format. They try to let everybody have their say.
Okay. I was just curious. I wondered if because of the political orientation, it might have gone more pro-conspiracy theory than against it.
Well, I tend to agree with you now that I've learned more about the history of things like false flag terrorism and the kind of relationship between media and government that I've seen over the last 10 years. I agree that the two-party system is something of a mirage, that there really, as Gore Vidal once said, there's really only one party in the United States. It's the property party, and it has two right wings. And I'm not sure exactly what he meant by right, but there does appear to be just one party in the United States.
The rentier class, they are pretty much useless other than taking money from other people for something that's a tangible asset, whether it's rent or whether it's your job. Rumsfeld, Donald Rumsfeld's name just keeps coming up and coming up. A lot of people didn't like him. They thought he was a harsh man, and then I couldn't resist reading that quote from the beginning of Chapter 2. He's a ruthless little bastard, that one, says Richard Nixon. So how can you put Rumsfeld's position into perspective for us? Did he have a little bit? I sense that he had much more influence than even we thought, and he appeared to have quite a bit.
Right. Yes, he did, and his colleague Dick Cheney also did, and the two of them represent an alternative Osama bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed for this book. So they aren't among the 19. They're the two people who were in perfect position to coordinate the attacks of 9/11. And Donald Rumsfeld has a very interesting history going back to the 60s when he worked for a private intelligence firm, and that launched him into a career in politics. He was a congressman for a number of years and became close with Gerald Ford, who ultimately helped him further along in his career. But Rumsfeld, for whatever reason, as a very young man in his early 30s, was given promotions into the Nixon administration and then the Ford administration that were really unprecedented in terms of the power that he held. He was a special assistant to Nixon. Then he became the White House Chief of Staff for Ford and the Secretary of Defense, the youngest Secretary of Defense, and then many years later, the oldest Secretary of Defense. But during the 90s, he really started showing that his approach seemed to be very hawkish. He was founder of the Project for a New American Century, PNAC. People may have heard of that. Neoconservative group that published really extremist sort of interventionist policy recommendations. Yep. And he, believe it or not, early in 2001, he made several comments stating essentially that nothing would change that needed to change until there was another Pearl Harbor. And that's the name of another book on 9/11 that just began going into the questions that haven't been answered. But Rumsfeld on 9/11 was missing during the height of the attacks, and he was actually the second most powerful person. As President Bush and the Secretary of Defense were what's called the National Command Authority. And one of the reasons that it appears that the 9/11 attacks were accomplished is that neither President Bush was available. He was pretty much taken out of the picture. And also Secretary Rumsfeld took himself out of the picture and just went missing at the height of the attacks for more than 30 minutes. So Rumsfeld and his partner Dick Cheney should be focused on, and I go into that in the book to some extent, and also how all of these other 19 suspects connect with these two men over the years, and how they had the same sort of motivations.
Here in your book, I just wanted to just back up from the actual text, what you just said. It's like by the time the second plane hit the WTC, Rumsfeld had moved on to a meeting with a CIA briefer. Reports vary on where he was after that, but National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice claimed she could not reach him. Some said that Rumsfeld continued with regularly scheduled meetings after the second strike, and he was on a roll with his predictions that morning. Apparently, he told Congressman Christopher Cox, "Believe me, this isn't over yet. There's going to be another attack, and it could be us." Minutes later, the Pentagon was hit. I mean, that's almost a case could be made for it being, just can't resist letting a little bit of "I know" something slip out. Maybe it's hubris, or
right.
You know what I mean?
This love of power seems to be a characteristic of Rumsfeld and Cheney over the years, and so that seemed to be reflected in those statements as well.
Give us a little profile on Dick Cheney.
Well, Dick Cheney was behind the lies that started the 1990 Gulf War, the first Gulf War. People may not know that there were two major lies that started that first Gulf War, and Dick Cheney was behind both of them, one of them being that there was a buildup of Iraqi troops on the Saudi border. That's how he convinced the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to allow American troops on Saudi Arabian soil and help them, therefore, invade Kuwait after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. We went in there with our troops and drove them out. But the other lie was told by a young Kuwaiti girl. She was coached by a company called Hill and Knowlton to tell lies about Iraqi soldiers taking babies out of incubators and leaving on the cold floor to die. Well, Cheney was behind that as well with Hill and Knowlton. And another suspect was actually, in this book, was closely related to Naira, is her name, as well, as I get into later into the book. But Dick Cheney, he's behind these Gulf War lies. He and Don were behind the 2003 lies to start the Iraq War. And in between there, we're essentially being told by the 9/11 Commission and others that we're to trust these people about their activities and what they say about 9/11. President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney both actively sought to prevent any investigation into 9/11. They called Tom Daschle, the Senate leader, and they actively sought to defund it. It was only funded at 1/10 of the amount that was allotted to investigate President Clinton's sexual exploits. So it was clear that these men did not want an investigation into 9/11, and on 9/11, Dick Cheney was definitely in a position of power. The most important person at the White House. He was in control in the bunker of the White House, the office called the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. And as well as that, there's been testimony from Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta that Dick Cheney was tracking one of the planes as it came into Washington. This is a somewhat famous testimony. Mineta said that a young man would come into the PEOC and tell Vice President Cheney that the plane was 50 miles out, and then he'd come back in and say the plane is 30 miles out. And when it came down to 10 miles out, he asked the Vice President, do the orders still stand? And the Vice President whipped his neck around and said, of course, the orders still stand. Have you heard anything to the contrary?
Yeah, I've heard that one.
These are the exact words of the testimony to the 9/11 Commission of Secretary of Transportation Norman Mineta, who, by the way, has stood by that testimony for years and still does, that Dick Cheney was aware of one of the planes coming in, although the official account said nobody knew anything about it. And there's some sort of orders that were given. So Cheney is very suspicious with regard to 9/11, and usually he's the one most suspected of having been involved.
Mm-hmm. What do you make of, Kevin, as we go through this thing, our interview is just like I say, just a couple of guys talking here. So I'm almost like, wow, a new friend. I want to ask him all kinds of stuff. Before we leave the destructive testing, what do you happen to know what temperature Jet A burns at?
Well, jet fuel burns at actually a lower temperature than office furnishings.
It's like 900 to 1,100 degrees, isn't it?
That's right. And what's more important with jet fuel is that everyone, including NIST, all of the government investigators, agree that the jet fuel burned off in just a few minutes. So as far as the failure of the steel, allegedly, or the destruction of the buildings, all the jet fuel did was make a big explosion and kind of theatrically, give us this notion that there was something terrible happening. Of course, there were many poor people dying in the buildings, but the jet fuel burned off in only about 5 minutes, according to NIST. So it was the fires that were fed by office furnishings that, according to NIST, caused this vast amount of steel in the building to originally to melt, and then they changed that to soften. And then finally, after I spoke out, they took all the softened wording out, and 7 months later came up with another report that said the steel had simply weakened. And this is unbelievable. I mean, it's like being given many different stories, and having the media ask us to believe each one as they come through.
I thought that was just, I talked to a friend of mine some years ago that, probably within 18 months after the event, he said, no, I've been on the internet. And I said, that sure looks like controlled demolition to me. I'm sorry, but, wouldn't you think if something crashed in on one side, something would tip over or something? But instead, just goes straight down. Both of them just go straight down like that. So I'm going out on the clothesline. I say it was controlled demolition. A lot of people think so. What do you think?
Absolutely. In fact, that's one of the premises of the latter half of the book, is that explosives were used at the World Trade Center. And, there's not just the false official accounts to support that, which people should see. The struggle that NIST went through of many different accounts, from pancake theory to columns-only theory to other theories, and finally this kind of vague pile driver theory that they have now. These were all failed attempts to explain how the buildings were destroyed through non-explosive means. But they never looked at the explosive demolition theory, and there's a great deal of support for that from near free-fall acceleration of the buildings, for one thing. We're talking about removing hundreds of connections, bolts and welds per second. Hundreds per second would have to be uniformly, simultaneously removed in order for the buildings to do what they did. And, we also see in the photographs these things that are called squibs. They're these high-velocity bursts of material shooting out like a cannon from the side of the building, not just from the collapse zone, but up to 30 floors below the collapse zone, these cannon shots. So those cannot be explained through a fire-based explanation. And not only that, but there were many witnesses to explosions and flashes of light and so on and so on. All of the evidence really points to the buildings having been destroyed through the use of explosives. Now, that in itself doesn't necessarily discount the 19 original suspects, except that I have done a great deal of investigation into who might have had access to those buildings in order to place explosives in them. And I don't see any evidence for these young, the average age of the people who were accused was only about 20 years old. And they're from foreign countries, mostly Saudi Arabia. And they just didn't have access to these buildings to plant explosives.
That doesn't sound good. Well, I'll tell you what, I can't believe the first hour is over already, but we have 2 more to go. So when we come back, let's go back to the personnel who were in charge of various agencies at the time this travesty was perpetrated. And that would be FBI Director Louis Freeh, who, if my memory serves me, he didn't really stick around very long after that event. Our guest tonight is a first-time guest. I love first-time guests. They're few and far between, but when they come on, they're pretty strong, and this is one of the strongest. His book is Another 19. That's the website, too. Another, and then use 19. And somebody just said his website's crashed. Sometimes that happens, Kevin. We crash sites. Get it? Investigating legitimate 9/11 suspects, Kevin Robert Ryan. We'll be back with him after a few messages and a little news. This is the Saturday night edition of Coast to Coast AM. It's not really my job to... This has been hinted at, but not actually directed right at me. But it'll do till the directing right at me gets here. And that is, it's not really my job to marshal the troops, start a big movement here or something. We like for the program to be entertaining, because we do a variety of subjects here, all kinds of stuff. Well, if you look at the definition of entertain, it could be amuse, divert, delight, please, charm, cheer, interest, and more. Give attention or consideration to an idea, suggestion, or feeling, but usually that's very entertaining. It's like, I think the common understanding of the meaning of that word would be amusement or enjoyment. And that makes me think of Tommy in Goodfellas, like, I amuse you. What, like a clown? That thing? But it also means to hold within, to keep hold or maintain in the mind. And so here in the midst of everything, I'll tell you what, I can't bear it. We're not going to break right now. Someone said Kevin R., that's Kevin Ryan, Kevin H., sent one that said, good night. This is more unbelievable. Charlie Romeo Alpha Papa. Rummy was in the Pentagon when it was attacked. He was missing because he was helping with the wounded. Have you heard anything to that effect? I haven't.
Yes, I have. But if you imagine that, so this is right after the building, the Pentagon, was struck, and at the time there were said to be multiple planes still in the air, hijacked and flying around the country.
Right.
And Rumsfeld, instead of contacting his subordinate in charge of the air defenses, Ralph Everhart, he claims that he just went out to the parking lot in the lawn to see if he could help. Now, obviously, there were a lot of people already helping there. That's not really what we needed the Secretary of Defense to do.
No, we got people for that.
Right. But more importantly, people like President Bush and Condoleezza Rice have made it clear they could not contact the Secretary of Defense for more than 30 minutes. So not only was he doing something that we didn't want him to do, but he wasn't available to speak to the president or the national security advisor at the height of the 9/11 attacks.
Yeah, it's a good thing they didn't send a second whatever it was toward the Pentagon, or he might have been a casualty himself.
Right. It seems like, he must have known, with all the things he was saying about, Pearl Harbor before it happened, and then he actually stated that the Pentagon would be a good next target after the second World Trade Center tower was hit. He stated that. And so then, the fact that he went and kind of lost himself, and when he was most needed, that was the point in his career, he was most needed by the United States, lost himself. That leads us to wonder if he knew what was going on, and perhaps he was looking to see if it was carried out well, or just removing himself from the situation.
All right, very good. Now, we do need to take this little floating break quickly, but I wanted to get back so not lose the momentum, So let's take 2 minutes here real quick and then come right back to discuss Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects by Kevin Robert Ryan on Coast to Coast AM. Stand by. All right, Mr. Ryan, let's carry on here. What about FBI Director Louis Freeh?
Well, Louis Freeh, along with George Tenet, who was director of the CIA, are in the book because they led agencies which appeared to simultaneously hype the threat of terrorism while not actually doing anything to prevent terrorism. And the FBI situation is pretty extreme. And I gave 15 examples in the book in which Louis Freeh's FBI, which was an agency that he led from 1993 to June of 2001, was either facilitating or covering up acts of terrorism. And this includes domestic terrorism, and I go through the many connections between the events at Oklahoma City in 1995 and the 9/11 attacks. It includes TWA Flight 800, which has become a hot topic of discussion lately due to a new film of that name that's come out. The investigators of that event are actually now calling for a new investigation into that tragedy. But also, there are some clear pieces of evidence that Louis Freeh's FBI was working with people who are seen as terrorists. So, for example, the man who was said to have trained leaders of Al-Qaeda is a guy named Ali Mohammed, and he was an FBI informant throughout the time that Freeh was the director. He was a special forces sergeant in the United States Army. He was, somebody who trained people like bin Laden, al-Zawahiri. So, the problem with this is that he was arrested in 1998, and he was allowed to plea bargain, and he's still never been brought to trial. It's like he's being protected. And Louis Freeh was the one who kind of started that. There are other examples, like I said, 15 examples of where the FBI seemed to be protecting these people who were told are terrorists. Two of the alleged 9/11 hijackers, for example, were living with an FBI informant for months in the year 2000. They were brought to San Diego, and they were hooked up, it appears, with Saudi agents who were also FBI informants or FBI assets. And I go into that in the book and talk about how Louis Freeh not only kind of appeared to lead this agency that facilitated or covered up terrorism, but they then, after 9/11, refused to cooperate with the 9/11 investigation. And Louis Freeh appears to have been someone who was close to the Saudi Prince Bandar, who is now the intelligence chief of Saudi Arabia, but back at that time was the ambassador to the United States from Saudi Arabia. So he was very close to Prince Bandar, had secret communications channels, much like director of CIA George Tenet did. And then finally, I go into the fact that after 9/11, both George Tenet and Louis Freeh joined the board of a company that had been flagged for 9/11 insider trading by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Now, to me, that if the government is not interested in looking through the 15 events in which the FBI seems to have facilitated terrorism, they might be interested in both Freeh and Tenet, the leaders of the U.S. intelligence community, joining a company that had been flagged for 9/11 insider trading. That should really be compelling. In any case, Louis Freeh and George Tenet are just two of the 19 suspects, and what I try to do in the first half of the book is kind of set up the issue. So, there certainly is truth to the fact that there's an Al-Qaeda organization, and now what we don't know is who is Al-Qaeda, who supports Al-Qaeda. If we go back to the 1980s, we learn that the United States funded the precursor to and trained the Mujahideen, the precursor organization to Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden, there's evidence that Osama bin Laden was funded by the CIA. And so we wonder in 2001 if Al-Qaeda was not still an asset organization for Western intelligence agencies, including the United States. And so that's what I try to get to in the first half of the book, kind of setting up the myth of Al-Qaeda and terrorism, and that being the greatest threat to the United States, and the fact that simultaneously these men were not investigating, they were not trying to prevent terrorism.
This is very, very, this is disturbing because it makes you wonder if the guys and gals that are CIA officers, and if CIA is primarily I don't want the double meaning here of the execution arm of policy, who then is really setting the policy? Because I don't think anybody is completely sure that it's the people we see, the president, for example. I think the president is a figurehead, personally.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I also believe that our government, unfortunately, does not act in our best interest. And we can, you've talked about Syria tonight, not with me, but to the listeners. And I think most people in the United States would agree that attacking another country as part of the war on terror, which originated with 9/11, is not in the best interest of the United States when we are $17 trillion in debt. We are morally bankrupt in many of the things our government is doing. So my point is that it appears that our president and some folks like Tenet and Freeh might be working for others. They're not working if they're not working in our best interest. I talk about something that was proposed by an author by the name of Peter Dale Scott, and he's a well-known historian, and he talks about the overworld, which is, and I know it sounds a little crazy, but the overworld in his term is a transnational group of people who are what he calls the politically minded rich. So I don't go into a great deal of that in this book, but you can see behind the scenes that these people seem to be operating under the directions of a higher authority and not the citizens of the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, we want to keep our focus narrowed to the point that we're dealing with your book, which is an extraordinarily rich book of over 400 pages. If it's all about the money, a while ago I floated the idea that when everybody was saying the only reason that we went over there is for the oil. Well, we didn't get the oil deals. Russia and China got the oil deals, Iran's the head of the snake. Well, Iran doesn't really have a history of the last war they were involved in was with Iraq. Now we're thinking that Iran would like to annex Iraq. So just as a thinking man here, not necessarily taking directly from your work, Another 19, what do you think the end game is here? Why? It's like, let's go to Syria just for a second. Has it occurred to anybody that if it gets too stupid over there, the Russians are already there, and they have a lot of experience in dealing with the Chechens, for example, and all the various stans down there to the south of Russia. Has it not occurred to anybody that they would chill it out themselves if it became too stupid? Do they think that they would just abandon their Navy base and leave?
Well, my impression is that the governments like the United States and Russia who are intervening and fighting proxy wars in places like Syria are doing so partly in opposition and partly in conjunction with each other, because the fact is that they do cross lines in terms of corporations. The corporations in the United States are partly owned by the Saudi Arabian government, partly owned by other nationals like the Russians and the British. And so it's the corporations that really have the power. The politicians ultimately work for them in many ways. But if there's a book, when we talk about Eurasia, that area of the world, which is very resource rich, not only with oil and gas, but other minerals and precious metals and so forth. There was a book in 1997 by a man named Zbigniew Brzezinski, who once was the Secretary of State under Carter, and he wrote The Grand Chessboard, and his conclusion, which has been followed and agreed upon internationally in many ways, is that the people who control Eurasia control the world. So Syria is one of 7 countries that were said by General Wesley Clark to have been part of a plan going back to the late 90s to invade, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon. If invade or control these countries, then you will control Eurasia. And I believe that that's part of what we're seeing with the war on terror overall.
I'm just wondering to what end.
Well, power.
Is that it?
Uncontrolled power, yes. I think that, the people that ultimately lead corporations and therefore the government are highly evolved power beings. They're beings that pursue power and pursue wealth, but wealth mainly, again, for power, it appears. And so, to be able to control the resources of the Middle East and Eurasia is enough, I think, to lead people like that to really do things that otherwise they might have seen, or we would certainly see as distasteful.
I'm sort of getting the idea that you reached a point that you just said, this may be a little risky to go into this, but I'm going to go ahead and go into it, because if I don't go into it, who's going to go into it? Am I close here? Because it seems like writing a book like this is enough to put a man on the clothesline.
Well, yeah, I suppose. On the other hand, the people that seem to get the clothesline are folks who are reporting on more current events. When it becomes history, it seems to be a little more tolerated. So I have been, as I said, as we talked about on many media programs, and I've been speaking out for many years, and there's no clothesline visible to me, although it's possible. But there was a man named Michael Hastings. He was a journalist in California. He died in a suspicious car wreck.
Mm-hmm. I spoke with him on the air here.
Did you really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Philip Marshall, too.
Yeah.
Philip Marshall wrote this book, The Big Bamboozle, that he was a United pilot, and he's not with us anymore either under questionable circumstances. When the official police report was released, I never saw such a comprehensive dossier on everything. They had everything in there except the flavor of toothpaste that he used. I never saw anything like it. And it just looked like just a wee bit too much detail for it to be as stated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it worries me a little bit. And
well, I think you led off the show stating that, we can stand by and play our Xboxes in so many words, and forget about things or, continue with mass consumption, or we can decide that as citizens we need to take responsibility for what's happening in our world. And that's what we're trying to do here. That's what I'm trying to do with this book. And if whatever it leads to, I welcome the opportunity to have lived meaningfully, and I think others agree with that sort of approach.
I think more and more all the time as people like you come forward and contribute to an ever-enlarging pool of truth. I wonder what will happen when we reach that point that we actually have the culprits and it's undeniable, or if there will be some sort of a tribunal held and then the results of that tribunal sealed for 50 years until we've departed the planet. We shall see. And we'll carry on with Kevin Ryan, his book, Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects. Got a lot more for you here on the Saturday night edition of Coast to Coast AM. Be patient and stand by. Yeah, there's a ghost in me that wants to say I'm sorry, but doesn't mean I'm sorry. When we come back with our first-time guest tonight, Kevin Robert Ryan, Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects. His website is Another 19, and use the number 19 when you go to it. Don't everybody go at once, or we'll break his server. But, no, seriously, we're going to talk about Richard Clarke, COG, and the United Arab Emirates. It seems that a fellow named Richard Clarke made a splash in alternative media. But as the story that he laid out there became digestible, it were the things that were not said with regard to Clarke's personal history and associations, because he claimed that if the CIA had simply told him, the FBI and the DOD, about Khalid al-Mindar and Nawaf al-Hazmi, even as late as September 4th, 2001, they would have conducted a massive sweep. We'd have conducted it publicly. We would have found them. There's no doubt in my mind, even with only a week left. However, there were some problems with Clarke's new claims, according to Kevin Ryan's book. For one thing, evidence indicates that FBI headquarters worked to protect the alleged 9/11 hijackers in the months leading up to 9/11. It's really a Alice in Wonderland world, isn't it? All that is what is not. We'll be right back with Mr. Ryan in just a moment. This is Coast to Coast AM. Kevin's really funny. I got got another email from Alan. He wants to know what radical group I work for. Well, the answer to that one is Coast to Coast AM. We're pretty radical, talking about flying saucers and 9/11 conspiracies and everything under the sun that might be real. It's being shielded from the public eye. That's pretty radical. And am I trying to overthrow the government? Well, if I could figure out who really is the government, I might think about it. But right now, I'm not really sure who the government is. So anyway, our buddy Alan, tell us about Richard Clarke and COG and the UAE. That's chapter 6 in your excellent book, Another 19.
Well, John, that was an excellent segue, actually, because if people if they remember 20 years ago, Bill Moyers, who's a famous journalist, was reporting on something he called the shadow government. And what he was referring to was a program called Continuity of Government, or COG. And this actually was promoted and funded through the Reagan administration, but the intent of the COG program was to find private citizens and potentially government representatives to form a replacement government in time of crisis. So the crisis for many years was a potential attack by the Soviet Union. And in 1998, that was transformed into the crisis of a major terrorist threat on a terrorist attack on U.S. soil. And the reason I mention it is that Richard Clarke, who was the counterterrorism czar from 1992 to 2001, he was among this select group, very small group of people who were going to be this replacement government, and they practiced over 20 years to essentially eliminate the Constitution and take over the United States. And so Richard Clarke was joined by Dick Cheney and by Donald Rumsfeld, by George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, James Woolsey, a former CIA director. These men practiced to take over the United States government. They practiced until 9/11. On 9/11 was the first and only time that COG was implemented. And so Richard Clarke actually implemented the continuity of government plan on 9/11 that morning. It persisted. It has persisted over years. And one problem with it is that even U.S. congressmen have not been allowed to see those plans and what they actually mean. Certain congressmen have asked for access and been denied access through that government law. So, in any case, Richard Clarke is a very suspicious character. The 9 years that he was counterterrorism czar, he appeared to be working alongside people who largely are suspect in the 9/11 crimes, and that includes the royal family of the United Arab Emirates. In this book, I talk about Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, which are these oil-rich royal families that govern in monarchy form over their people. They were also very close to certain people in the United States, the George H.W. Bush group, and they in the United Arab Emirates owned what was called the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Again, 20 years ago, if people remember 20 years ago, many times if people just remembered their history that far back, we wouldn't have as many problems as we do. But the BCCI, or Bank of Credit and Commerce International, was known to be a terrorist financing network. And the United Arab Emirates owned that, and Richard Clarke was basically a representative of that country through his time as counterterrorism czar. Well, another thing that's important there is that even the 9/11 Commission says that the funding for the alleged hijackers came through the United Arab Emirates, that all of the alleged hijackers traveled to the United States through the United Arab Emirates. And so the problem is that wasn't followed up in terms of that government's possible involvement in the crimes. In take into account BCCI, the terrorist financing network owned by that country, and that Richard Clarke, the counterterrorism czar, was basically representing the UAE in many ways. And he was not only representing them in business ways or in policy ways, but there were two distinct occasions in which Richard Clarke personally prevented the capture or killing of Osama bin Laden in the few years before 9/11. And this is pretty well documented, even in the official investigations. A congressman asked Richard Clarke very pointedly about why he tipped off the United Arab Emirates when they were hunting. They were regularly meeting with Osama bin Laden, these friends of Richard Clarke, the man who was supposed to be protecting us from 9/11. He tipped off his friends in the United Arab Emirates about these plans of the CIA, and they were then therefore foils. We could have captured bin Laden many times, and even the 9/11 Commission comes out and says if it wasn't for our protection of the United Arab Emirates, 9/11 would never have happened. So, yeah, the issues with regard to Richard Clarke and the other two we mentioned, Louis Freeh and George Tenet, appear to be these folks were coordinating or allowing these alleged terrorists to live in the United States, to work and openly use their own names in the United States. 2 of them lived with an FBI informant. And all along, Richard Clarke, Louis Freeh, and George Tenet are just letting this go.
They lived with FBI informants.
Absolutely. Almadar.
And this is a matter of record. This is true. This is not speculation. This is true.
It is absolutely true. It is actually recorded in the official investigations. Not only that, but the CIA and the FBI would not allow that informant to be interviewed by the 9/11 Commission or the Joint Inquiry. Now, this is, I know it sounds unbelievable, but it's true. This man, Abdul Sattar Sheikh was his name, basically was a Saudi agent, and he was also an FBI informant. He was the landlord and the housemate of 2 of the alleged 9/11 hijackers in the year before 9/11, and that they were not allowed. The FBI, the Joint Inquiry and the 9/11 Commission requested to interview. Obviously, this man who lived with 2 of them must have known a great deal about Al Qaeda, and they were refused. Not only that, but his lawyer basically said that he's not going to testify, and they didn't. The reason this doesn't make any sense to me, John, is that there are other people who were captured and tortured just horrendously, but yet this man was just allowed to not only get off the hook, but a couple of years later, he was given $100,000 and his case was closed. So
I'll tell you. Here's the thing. This is what sends my mind spiraling upward into the nebula. What you're saying tonight makes such a completely perfect case for no term limits for people in Congress. The same crews over and over again. A real good question about now would be, didn't the Somalis have bin Laden and Clinton let him go? Think so. And it just seems to be these guys like Clark are just doing, as Eddie Temple said in Layer Cake, practicing the art of good business, just being really good middlemen. But the question is, this is what it could easily induce some despondency, and that is, these people don't care what we know. I think it's that somebody said they don't really care what you know until they find out how much you care about what you know. And I just don't, this apparatus seems to be so big, so well controlled, and they just look at the camera and go, we didn't know anything. And then you have somebody like this little gal who's a former CNN reporter, Amber Lyon, saying, oh no, we actually got paid not to run certain stories and paid to run certain stories in furtherance of what we'll have to call a political agenda. My question at this point to you is sort of an unpleasant one, I'm afraid, but what can possibly be done about this when you continue to shine light on this, and when what happened becomes more and more obvious and still nothing happens? What do you do? Pray for divine intervention? I think it's coming down to that, because these guys aren't going anywhere.
Right. And, well, I think there are 2 objectives that supersede that. And one of them is that, the revealing of this kind of history, the hidden history of 9/11, that's the title of one book that I contributed to. The revealing of that history helps us understand what's really going on and hopefully either prevent another terrorist attack or avoid it, or at least respond to it more quickly next time in sensible ways. So if, as you said, there are people who they're not just long-term congressional representatives that we're talking about, but people going through what's called the revolving door in the federal government where they take high-level positions in government, and then they go and they profit from the policies that they put in place in the private sector and big corporations, and then they go right back to the government and they do it again, and that continues in this revolving door. Well, I believe there still is a chance to recover our democracy in the United States. There's a lot of work to do. Part of it is revealing history that has been hidden or that has been obfuscated. The other part is fighting for certain objectives. Like, for example, I believe one of our biggest challenges are the risks with electronic voting machines. And I believe that's another subject that can help us. We learn about it and we demand in our own communities that these things are controlled in ways where they can't be backdoor accessed or, because you look at the 2000 and the 2004 elections and other elections, and you wonder how the results could totally contradict the exit polls, for example. So those are the things that I think about, that this kind of activity that we're doing today will help us in terms of leading towards changes that'll turn this thing around.
Yeah, wrongs really can't be made right. And once they're done, they're done. But so the only thing left really is future, and to, as you say, prevent more of it. Well, that's you do what you can do. You do all you can do, and it's like you have your say and you're done, and you do whatever you can do, and then you've done it. At least you can check out of the planet knowing you did something besides just stand there and take it. Let's go to, if you don't mind, let's go to Caravan Sliney and the FAA. We're dealing with a lot of three-letter agencies tonight, FAA, UAE, stuff like that.
Yeah. The FAA and the other agency called NORAD, a military group, were the two groups that the 9/11 Commission ultimately determined were, responsible, but not responsible. It's funny how that works. The failure of their communications. The 9/11 Commission said the failure of the communications between the FAA and NORAD is what caused the total failure of the nation's air defenses on 9/11. And so if people
just on that particular day, right? Just
on that day, just for 2 hours. Mm-hmm. It's just just after 8 a.m. and just after 10 a.m. on that morning. All of the procedures that are normally followed were not followed, not only in terms of the NORAD, the military response, but in terms of communications between the FAA and NORAD. And so I began talking about this with two guys from the FAA, Benedict Sliney, who was the National Operations Manager, and Michael Canavan, who was the FAA's hijack coordinator. The two things that jump right out to you with these two guys is they had both just started their jobs. In fact, Sliney was in his first day on the job as National Operations Manager at the FAA. Now, this is surprising, given that he was the lead for the FAA in responding to the hijackings. And although there were other people at the FAA who were present, who had seniority over him, all of the testimony that's come out of the 9/11 Commission points to Sliney as being the guy they all deferred to in his first day on the job. Things about Sliney that also jumped out to me was that he had spent the 15 years before that as basically a lawyer for Wall Street, a lawyer for financiers. He had air traffic control experience before that, but he had spent the 80s and the 90s basically as a lawyer, a high-priced Wall Street lawyer, and for some reason decided to go back to the FAA just before 9/11, and for some reason was just given the position of National Operations Manager. And so that jumped out to me. I talk about that in the book a little bit, but the things that happened on 9/11 that Sliney contributed to had to do with the FAA requesting military assistance for the hijacked planes, and Sliney did not do that. Despite knowing about the first hijacking at 8:15 in the morning, for 2 hours he did not request military assistance. So, he gave some very poor excuses about he was not aware that he was supposed to request, or not aware to approve a request, to make a request to have military assistance. He didn't even know, apparently, what the military was going to do if they were asked for assistance. All of this contradicts the basic procedures between the FAA and NORAD.
And is it your understanding that Mike sent an email in saying, no, it's incompetence is what caused this, because there was no training protocol that would involve responding to an attack within the country? Is that straight, or is that not straight?
Not from what I've learned. The things that prevented the interception had to do with the lack of communications from the FAA and a number of things going on in the military, including highly coincidental military exercises that were mimicking the attacks that day and that were injecting false radar data on the screens of the responders.
Oh, good grief. Have you noticed that just every time that a catastrophe happens, there was some sort of a drill or an exercise that preceded it? We still have an hour to go with our first-time guest tonight, Kevin Robert Ryan. His book, Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects, on the Saturday night edition of Coast to Coast AM. We'll be right back. Thanks to everybody who have become Coast Insiders, because it's programs just like this one tonight with our first-time guest and author of Another 19, Kevin Ryan. You're going to want to replay this show a few times. Go and check it out. Oh, and by the way, a while ago I said we were talking about the fuel that exploded for when the airplanes crashed into the towers. And it's true. Jet A is closer to kerosene and diesel number one. I said number one farm diesel. In fact, while most modern diesel engines specify diesel number two, many diesel engines will run on Jet A. And in fact, some of those old Russian jets that people occasionally buy will actually run for a while and run well on number one farm diesel. It's just a matter of additive. So let's not get caught up in that thing about, is it the summertime blend or the wintertime blend? There are slight differences, but they're all related. Jet A, kerosene, and diesel, they are very, very closely related. Okay, just a little scientific fact there. And another, thank you for becoming Coast Insiders. You make our day every time somebody signs up, because you find value in the program. And that's good, because if you don't find value in the program, guess what? It won't be around very long. You get 3 years of archive shows. It's very inexpensive. It's a nice service. You'll enjoy it. And if you ever have any trouble of any kind, logging on or logging in or anything like that, and you got a problem, you're going, I'm mad, I wanted to get on it, I can't do it. I just email Lex at Coast to Coast AM, and he'll have it sorted out for you in about 10 seconds, okay? We'll be right back with Kevin Ryan in just a moment. This is Coast to Coast AM. Kevin Ryan, it's really good to have you on the program tonight. It's a fascinating discussion tonight, and even though some of these elements have been discussed over and over again, you've really put a different light on it, and this is such a comprehensive work. It's difficult to deny the veracity of it. How long did it take you to put this together? This looks like it's got to be a couple of 3 years.
Yeah, 4 years actually, John. And I began looking at the people who had access to the World Trade Center in early 2009. So it took me 4 years to accumulate the information, the research, and the last year and a half, I really focused on putting it together in a book.
Let's seg just for a moment over to the Pentagon. Now, just between ourselves, and I've asked this question to John Lear. I asked it to Philip Marshall. Now, I can't explain this, but John Lear said, you know John Lear, he's flown, 100 and something different types of aircraft. His dad, invented all kinds of stuff. And, he's a hell of an aviator, and he said totally impossible to get that aircraft to that speed and for it to hit that building at that right at that spot at almost ground level at the Pentagon. Philip Marshall, on the other hand, said, Philip, the hole in the wall is smaller than the diameter of the fuselage. And where is the indestructible landing gear? Where are the near indestructible engines? Where are the marks on the building? What do you make of that strike there? And then let's talk about Frank Probst.
Yeah. The Pentagon is a topic of lively discussion amongst those of us who are interested in 9/11 truth, that's for certain. The exact story of what happened is still, I'd say, out of reach, but there's a lot to explain. As you said, this is a Boeing 757, and it engaged in what everyone who has seen the data has agreed was a miraculous corkscrew dive over a period of over a distance of thousands of feet, and came out of that corkscrew dive going, according to the official account, 500 miles per hour and hitting the first floor of the Pentagon, just at top speed.
I thought it was 500 knots, but it might be miles per hour. In any case, it was quite fast. And what a shot, right there, almost at ground level.
Yeah, the thing that drew me to this most strongly was that the plane hit a very small section of the building that had been the focus of a renovation plan. And I go into that in the book, basically asking the question, was this renovation project part of this attack? And I learned that the company that was hired to complete the renovation was called AMEC, A-M-E-C, was led by a man who was a close business partner of Donald Rumsfeld. His name was Peter Jansen. And not only were they hired for this $258 million renovation project in the exact small area where the plane hit, which had just been completed right before the attack, they were hired in a no-bid contract to clean up the mess, and then they were hired as the lead contractor to clean up the World Trade Center site as well. So they were in control of the evidence at the World Trade Center. They were the ones who constructed this impact zone. And I believe what happened, and I think a lot of people agree with me, is that there were explosives in the building. And I believe the explosives would explain to some extent what evidence you've mentioned, the size of the holes. It's not just the size of the holes and their ability to match up to the carbon-nosed Boeing jet, but the
perfectly round. Sorry.
Yeah, the question of how this jet could have punched through 3 rings of the Pentagon. Now, whether it was going 500 miles per hour or not, and the question is how that carbon-nosed aircraft, aluminum fuselage aircraft, could have punched through. Now, people may say, well, maybe it was one of the engines, but then again, you've got a mismatch again, I think. But I talk about Frank Probst, as you said, because he was the main witness to this plane, close-up to this plane impacting the building. And some interesting coincidences with him is he just happened to be checking the area where the plane hit in the few minutes before the attack. It turns out this guy was a lieutenant colonel, retired from the Defense Communications Agency, and now that's the agency that's in control of the satellites in the American airspace. And he's checking something right there at the point of impact. He goes off to a construction trailer, and they talk about these attacks occurring, and then he leaves the construction trailer, and the plane allegedly flies right over his head. I mean, it couldn't be just a matter of feet, because the plane hit just 6 feet above the ground.
Yeah.
Now, one question with that is the wake, the turbulence that a Boeing 757 generates 6 feet away from the plane is known to be dramatic.
Pretty rough, yeah, especially if it's doing 500 miles an hour.
Yeah, so how this man lived to tell the story is one question. Then he told the story, and he talked about how he was just happened to be there, and he just happened to be talking about the attacks in the construction zone. But the plane hit that very construction entrance where they were working on it. And I go into a hypothesis. I make it clear that it's a hypothesis, attempting to explain more of the unanswered questions, because we have not been successful in either fully explaining or agreeing upon what exactly happened at the Pentagon. But I talk about remote control and the technology available to control these aircraft, which was very well established on 9/11. In fact, exercises were being conducted in the months before 9/11 to utilize these technologies for guidance of a large airliner. Really, they were very precise in their ability to control the aircraft, to bring it in the aircraft into a certain area. In fact, experts said that that planes could have been flown directly into the Oval Office back then if it was necessary. So I talk about this remote control technology and how the equipment for it, even go into the exact equipment that would be needed, how it would appear that it would have fit very well in these construction trailers, which were just outside the impact zone of the building, which is just where the plane hit. So I talk about that, and Frank Prost, as you said, and I go into a colleague of Probst, fellow West Point graduate Paul Mlakar, who was hired to do the investigation of the building afterward, and how he had been accused years later of obstructing the Hurricane Katrina investigation, and how he was connected through family, through marriage, to a man who worked with Allen Dulles, the famous CIA director, and just, the issues about him having conducted experiments on explosions at the Pentagon in the years before 9/11. And so all I try to do is explain more of the unanswered questions. Why did the plane hit that impact zone? How could it have possibly been flown, regardless of what kind of plane if it was? I mean, it might have been a large plane of another type, but most of the witnesses do talk about a large aircraft hitting the building, and it did appear to be flown like a guided missile. So those are some of the things that I go into.
Well, and what happens the moment that somebody is out there fooling around in their little Cessna and they start going into restricted airspace? I'll tell you what happens. A jet shows up right next to you going, you better wiggle your wings and let us know that you're going to do exactly what we tell you. And you couldn't fly into restricted airspace. I mean, around the Pentagon and the Capitol and so forth. You couldn't get anywhere near that place without having a jet on you. Before 9/11, they'd send something up there real quick. They got nothing to do all day except sit on the tarmac and wait to be scrambled. They live for that.
Absolutely. That area that you're mentioning over Washington, D.C. is the most highly secure airspace in the country. It's got a special code, P56 is the area. And I talk about in an earlier chapter on NORAD, the failure of the planes the interceptor jets to intercept the hijacked aircraft. But they did this routinely every year, 129 times in the year before, and yet they couldn't catch up to any of the 4 hijacked airliners on 9/11, none of which squawked the hijack code. That means put in their transponder that they were being hijacked. None of them did that, almost as if they were using technology that day that was available and was patented just after 9/11 to take control of a hijacked aircraft and shut down its communications and just do whatever it is that the remote pilot might want to do with the plane.
That sounds a lot more plausible than some guys getting some simulator training and then being able to place those aircraft right where they placed them. Marshall said, and he was a United pilot, he just said, look, and Lear said it too, he goes, they both said, we're skilled pilots. I mean, they didn't say that. They said, I'm a skilled pilot. It would be a real problem for me to get in an aircraft like this, take over, and then put them right on target. No problem at all. That would be an enormous task for even the most seasoned pilot. These guys had no trouble with it whatsoever. So, I think that anytime we hear about technology like Michael Hastings' car, he was suspicious of his rented Mercedes, and he thought it had been hacked. And there appears to be ample evidence indicating that his computer system was hacked. These couple of guys, I can't remember what university they were at now, but they said, look, we'll take this laptop, we'll plug it in. Well, if you can do it by plugging it in, you can do it by Bluetooth, you can do it by probably some other methods that we don't even know about. Certain cars have had black boxes built into them for years. Well, we're just now starting to hear about that. So I have no doubt that the technology that we hear about has been operational for a good length of time before anybody got a whiff of it.
Yeah, I think you're right, John. The Pentagon is still a work in progress in terms of answering the questions, but I believe that remote control technology, which was available at the time, had a part in it, and I also believe the renovation project that was connected to Donald Rumsfeld's fellow director, Peter Jansen, had a part in it as well.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, the old rabbit hole, this is not a rabbit hole, this is more like a I don't know, an elephant hole or something. It's just, it's ridiculous. Going over to let's see, this is going to be Chapter 11. Brian Michael Jenkins says, terrorism is theater.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we've got a lot of mileage out of that. Adolf Hitler was very fond of terrorism. He said, oh, yeah, that's the one right there, because the thought of being annihilated just without warning, that really gets the public's attention. We can get a lot of mileage out of this.
Yeah, people seem to be compelled to do any number of things in order to make themselves and their family safe. And that's reasonable to some extent, unless they're being given information that's clearly false, like the official reports on the attacks of 9/11. When I talk about Brian Michael Jenkins, I talk about his history as a special operations soldier, and several people in the book were connected to special operations, but also his history as being a right-wing advisor for Reagan in conducting a terror war in Central America in the 1980s, and how that seems startling given that he worked as deputy chairman for Kroll Associates, a company that designed the World Trade Center security system after the 1993 bombing. And Jenkins not only designed that World Trade Center security system, but he did consider exactly the things that happened on 9/11. And he and his partner L. Paul Bremer, who's also covered in that chapter, were very interesting characters, given that they led the nation in being experts on counterterrorism, and they created in large part the myth of Al-Qaeda terrorism from the existing Soviet threat of terrorism. And I talk about the commissions they were on and how that evolved, how the Cold War threat, which kind of died out, unfortunately, as the Soviet Union collapsed for them. It was unfortunate, and they were terrorist experts, and then that was transformed into a threat of Islamic terrorism throughout the 1990s. And Jenkins and Bremer were leading characters in that. And they both played very interesting roles with regard to aviation security, and were both connected to the World Trade Center in important ways.
Kevin, one of the sickest possibilities that I can think of at this moment is that while there might have been some militancy from the Islamic world, it seems that we've done everything that we can possibly do to ensure that there would be high levels of militancy toward us from the Muslim world.
Right.
It's almost as though we deliberately jacked them up and continued to until it's like, okay, now we got them mad. Now we've got an enemy. It's almost as though we created an enemy. Am I just completely out to lunch on this? And if I am, just say so. I can take it.
No, I think there's a little bit of truth to both, but there has been a concerted effort to control the narrative, and I believe that's connected to an effort to co-opt terrorism and promote it and exacerbate it in the ways that you have described.
Well, we got a terror war is starting to blossom. Well, it's starting to bloom. It hasn't quite completely blossomed yet, but we've got that going on in Africa now, in sub-Saharan Africa. And the Chinese are starting to move in a little bit more there. You never can tell. Your friends are your enemies, and your enemies are your friends. Who knows? Well, let's take our little break. It's been a quick couple of hours and a half, but we still have more with first-time guest Kevin Robert Ryan. Go to his website, Another 19, and use the number 19 in the title, another19.com, and come back quick. This is Coast to Coast AM. That's pretty much what we have to do, unenlightened, but we will be as we go on. We just need to keep on sailing, just sail on through it. Tell you what, when we come back, golly, what a quick night. Just like the month of August seemed like it blew by. In fact, the whole summer just blew by. Talking with Kevin Ryan tonight, we want to explore the money aspect when we come back, because there was some little bit of monkey business, maybe some shares being shorted, stuff like that, just prior to the attacks, maybe some money that was lying around that has yet to be picked up. And don't you find that even though, and it's documented in this excellent book, Another 19 by Kevin Ryan, that as of the mid-'90s, it was just generally accepted that the whole Gulf of Tonkin fiasco was a fraud and a false flag, which pulled us into the Vietnam War. So, and we were there for what they call it, the 10,000-day war or something. I haven't done the math on it, but it certainly felt like 10,000 days if it was not. It's September. Happy September, everybody. It's September 1. And guess what? Next Sunday is the second Sunday of the month. So it'll be next weekend. It's going to be you and me for 3, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And there are some amazing programs scheduled for you. Feel certain that you will enjoy them. Who are they? Who are they? Oh, you'll find out. And you'll go, what? And you will like it. So stand by. We still have some more time with Kevin Ryan tonight, and we're going to get to it just as soon as we do this thing that we have to do on Coast to Coast AM. Kevin Ryan, earlier tonight I was reading a little news story off the coasttocoastam.com website about the two fellows that got together, and one of them's hand began to move across on the other side of the campus because of a thought of his partner on the far side, and they're connected electronically and so forth. So, so many people, I mean, I've absolutely heard it all. I'm sure you have too. It's like everything from no planes hit the towers to holograms were used to deceive everybody, and it was a particle beam weapon, some sort of energy weapon. It's unbelievable. Some people, you can show them, look, here's the fabric. It's red. And they go, no, it's not. And it's either because they're colorblind or they're just stubborn. But there are too many things all coming together. Everything from the people who were involved, a few of which we've covered. It would take us a 20-hour interview to thoroughly discuss your work. And I recommend that. I really recommend. Books are great. I mean, I like ebooks. I like that stuff. But there's nothing like having a book you can hold in your hand. Just take a little side trip here. To obtain your book, we would go where? Amazon, the usual places, or your website, or where?
Yeah, Amazon. That's right.
Okay. All right, very good. So in the end, there's the money factor. And let's see, I'm over here to, where am I? Yes, I'm on chapter 12. And the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission referred specific instructions or transactions, rather, to the FBI for criminal investigation. Whatever became of that? How much money was involved?
Well, the issue of insider trading on 9/11 involves a great deal of money, and it also involves more than one financial vehicle. You know, we're talking about stock trades like those on the airlines that were impacted on 9/11, or the exact companies that were in the World Trade Center towers. We're talking about treasury bonds at a higher level. We're talking about credit card transactions mysterious credit card transactions that occurred that morning on the computers in the buildings, and how those computer hard drives were recovered over time and restored by companies that said that they reflected what they called doomsday dealings, so transfer of large amounts of money. But insider trading in this chapter points to a man named Wirt Walker, who was the CEO for a company called Stratesec. So we talked about the design of the World Trade Center security system by Kroll Associates and Brian Jenkins, but that design was implemented by Stratesec. People may have heard of this company because on the board was George W. Bush's brother Marvin, and the CEO was this man, Wirt Walker. And the SEC flagged some trades that Walker and his wife did on Stratesec stock, and it was not very evident at first, but the 9/11 Commission released documents, and then it was revealed that it was Wirt Walker and his wife that were involved. So the 9/11 insider trading, I actually wrote a chapter of a book for Jesse Ventura. He's got a book called 63 Documents the Government Doesn't Want You to Read, and documents 48 and 49 are from me regarding the 9/11 insider trading issue. And but there are other really important reasons why Wirt Walker and his companies should just jump right out to people. Stratesec, Marvin Bush, of course, the other directors of Stratesec, including the guy I wrote about in the next chapter, Barry McDaniel, and his connections to Iran-Contra, and the fact that all of this was owned by a Kuwaiti company. Now, if people don't know, Ramzi Youssef, who was convicted of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was a Kuwaiti. So right after that, then for some reason, the World Trade Center security implementation was led by a company owned by Kuwaitis. That was seen as just unprecedented, that a foreign company of any kind would have security contracts for the World Trade Center and Dulles Airport in Washington. But
unbelievable.
Yeah, it really is. And so I go into in these chapters Stratesec and the Kuwaiti parent company and a little bit of 9/11 insider trading. But if you really want the story on that, my more detailed work is in Jesse Ventura's book.
Okay. Doomsday dealings, they already had a term for it?
Well, yeah, this company, Convar, a German company, they recovered the hard drives from the computers that were engaged in these massive transactions of funds, and they showed that someone was involved with stealing large amounts of money on the morning of 9/11 through these computers. But you mentioned that some of the money wasn't even on the stock trades, wasn't even claimed afterwards. There was millions of dollars in stock trades that were done before 9/11, and if people wonder, there's really not a lot of question about it anymore, because several international teams of experts at universities around the world have proven statistically that these were insider trades on with foreknowledge of the events of 9/11. And so given that, the fact that they were not investigated either by the FBI or the 9/11 Commission, and what I mean by that is that the people who were named were not even interviewed, and they were just said to have no connections to Al-Qaeda. As I go into my book, Wirt Walker does have some interesting connections to Al-Qaeda. And it's clear that the 9/11 Commission and the FBI did not do their jobs with regard to this investigation.
Or maybe they were blocked from it.
It's possible.
What about Giuliani? Some of his comments that were caught on tape were a little odd as he was strolling through the rubble. Oh, I always liked Rudy, but he was not cast in the best light in some of these segments.
Right, and with him, it's clear that he had been given information that the buildings would collapse when none of the fire chiefs at the site or anywhere else would have predicted these buildings, which were designed for just this sort of thing and had been, as we talked about, certified for fire resistance. None of the fire chiefs thought these buildings would fall at all, let alone at free fall acceleration. But somehow Giuliani was given the information that they would. Now, Giuliani also has connections to BCCI, which we talked about before, the terrorist financing network. He led the enforcement actions against BCCI, and then he went to work for a law firm that represented BCCI. These things really need to be followed up, given his leading role at the site of the World Trade Center attack and his political gain, enormous political gain from having been seen as the hero of 9/11.
Have I missed something here? Well, I don't see any mention. Another conspiracy component to the overall theories of what may have happened on that day involved the Israelis and Mossad agents dancing around the van, excitedly laughing and to talk about the event and so forth. What? Do you have anything on that?
Yeah,
might as well cover it.
I talk about the dancing Israelis and how that indicated they were discovered to be Mossad agents.
Okay, so it's a real deal. That's not an urban legend. That's a fact.
No, these people were filming the event as it was occurring. They were arrested. They were kept in jail for 73 days, and later on television in Israel, they admitted they were there to film the event. They were intelligence operatives. Now, I do go into that in the book, and so one point I make is that, if Israel or elements of the Israeli government were involved, which would not be surprising given that they benefited from the attacks, then I believe that we need to still focus on the people who were in position to make things happen. So if there were, for example, Douglas Feith, who was a leading advisor to Paul Wolfowitz. Paul Wolfowitz is one of the suspects in the book. He has strong connections in support of Israel, but his assistant, Douglas Feith, has even stronger connections and worked in the Pentagon as well. If it can be revealed more in detail what they specifically did, that's what we need to learn in terms of whether or not they were representing Israel in the attacks. It's possible. And as I said, we need to keep open minds about all of this. Israel is basically a protected, and we basically, our military oftentimes seems to be working for Israel. And so those questions are legitimate, and whether or not Israeli agents were involved, I think needs to be more fully revealed, and also specifically what they did to accomplish the attack. So I go into the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait as being foreign governments that need to be investigated, Israel as a possibility. But when we talk about who specifically, we need to say what they did. And the Mossad is defined basically by the word deception. So, keep in mind that it's not going to be readily apparent. It could be some of these 19 suspects were Mossad operatives. It's not going to be readily apparent, given their modus operandi, who is or is not a Mossad agent.
Oh yeah, well, that's a tough crew. They really are, and they got very long arms. They can reach out and touch just about anybody they feel the need to. As we get close to the end of our time together tonight, we did not cover everybody because, well, we only had 3 hours. But you've written here that most of the suspects reviewed were shown to have benefited from the 9/11 attacks through promotions or political or business gains. But there's an intangible benefit to consider as well. Many of them were players in the last war in which the United States was defeated.
Yeah.
That's a strange angle.
It is. It just seemed to continue to crop up. The people who were in position to make 9/11 happen as it did, many of them were special operations specialists. Many of them were combat veterans like Frank Probst from Vietnam, and special operations veterans. Dick and Don basically were in the White House at the time of Vietnam. And many of the other people, Bremer and Richard Clark and Wolfowitz, were in government at that time as well. And they were the hawks, basically. They were the ones promoting the Vietnam War, defending the actions of Nixon and Ford. And it's clear that they were really decimated by the defeat. I mean, there's an author, Kevin Phillips, who wrote a book, and he said basically Vietnam was the seed of the Iraq War. It was the lingering, emotional driver to for some people to conduct wars that they knew they could win, that they would never be defeated again. And, Dick and Don and a lot of these characters appear to have been among those who were along what Kevin Phillips said, looking for ways to be heroes again.
I just don't know where. I don't know what to make of this. It's from the perspective of the citizen, is it a strategic objective of one kind or another, either the power that you spoke of earlier, just power for power's sake? Is it enrichment? Is it hubris? Is it just some people just don't mind sitting there watching the world burn? I mean, I suppose all of those are possibilities. After all, once you strip away the titles of office and everything else, they're just human beings like everybody else. Some would argue that they're actually reptilians with really realistic human suits stretched over them. But for the moment, we'll go with them all being human beings. It's just difficult to predict what their next move will be. Other than the obvious, the Syrian problem here. As you look at this, and then, of course, I'm sure you keep up with the current events as well, what do you see as the next, or do you see a bright blip on the screen other than Syria, which I think is going to, I personally don't think it's going to morph into World War III. I think it's just going to kind of peter out and go away, and everybody will get over it, and we'll reset and see if we can set up something else a little bit more cleverly next time.
Yeah, I think that as far as bright blips, things to look out for, maybe not positive things. I think the efforts of the National Security Agency to spy on all Americans and the lack of outrage, in my opinion, that is occurring is something to continue to watch because, it's been revealed by the whistleblower Snowden that the NSA is collecting emails, phone messages, everything, if only metadata, some part of it, on all Americans. There's a database now of all communications. The other thing that I recently wrote an article on was what I call drone terror. The use of these drone aircraft to fight battles, undeclared wars around the world. The United States is bombing with drones half a dozen countries as we speak, and most of them we have not declared war against. More importantly, there are 30,000 plus drones being manufactured for use within the United States, according to reports. And those are things we need to watch. We need to think about how we can live with those things if they're not going to be removed, if they're not going to be backtracked. How can we live with the fact that drones will be will be in our environment, and all of our communications are being watched. And are we going to have the courage to continue to speak out and ask for facts and truth that will lead us more to justice and some lasting positive change? I think that's what we need to continue to do. So hopefully people do have the spirit to do that in our country.
It was excellent to have you on the program tonight, Kevin. Really, really good. And I hope everybody will pick up a copy of Another 19 by Kevin Robert Ryan. You can get it on Amazon. I'm going to check in with you from time to time just to make sure everything's okay, all right?
Yeah, thank you, John, and thanks to everybody at Coast to Coast.
Well, you're welcome. It was a pleasure to have you on the program. Well, there you have it. I don't mind being the authority when I can masquerade as one. I don't mind playing the newbie either. We will talk to you on Friday next, Saturday next, and Sunday as well. And remember, wasn't it Voltaire who said, "Uncertainty is not pleasant, but certainty is absurdity"? Voltaire, the French, they have such a good way of putting these things, yes? It's been a pleasure to be with you tonight. For everybody at Coast to Coast AM, have a very, very pleasant, long, and above all, safe Labor Day weekend. Don't labor too hard. And when you come back on Tuesday, I have an idea. Patricia says it's showtime. Why don't you just take a minute and call your elected official, if you know who they are, and tell them, we don't think it's a good idea for you to sanction another military action, so knock it off now or I'll vote you right out, me and everybody else. Good night, and be well.